quick warning, you may want to skip this episode if you're a bit squeamish. This is a species truly worthy of a Halloween special. At first glance, Dementor wasps probably don't seem all that frightening. 1 centimetre long and weighing a single gram, they actually don't look all that different from a winged ant. And this is very deliberate. Ants aren't always a popular food source for other animals, so some species will evolve to look similar to them in the hopes of not being preyed on. Although sometimes the reason is kind of the opposite. A wasp species will look like an ant because they themselves prey on ants, and it makes it easier to get to their prey. But that's not the case with the Dementor wasp. No, ants would not be creepy enough for Halloween. Instead, Dementor wasps feast entirely upon cockroaches. Now, I know what you're thinking. They sting cockroaches with a fatal dose of venom and then eat their bodies, right? Wrong. It is so much more horrifying than that. Yeah, the wasp will sting its prey, but not with the intention of killing it. Instead, they ensure that their sting goes directly into the cockroach's head, sending their venom straight into the poor roach's neural nodes, with the toxin then blocking the octopamine receptors of their prey. This means that, while the cockroach is still very much alive, they're unable to control their own movements. They become like zombies. And that's not just me being hyperbolic or deliberately Halloweeny. That is literally the word used by scientists who've studied these guys. They refer to the cockroaches as becoming passive zombies. The venom doesn't paralyse them or anything, they can still move, they just need some kind of external help. And because of this, rather than needing to be dragged into the wasp's burrow, which would be much harder for the wasp, instead, all they have to do is give them a bit of a nudge and the cockroach goes running straight into their burrow at top speed. Almost as if they're under some kind of mind control. And the exact way this works is still not fully understood by scientists. We don't know exactly how the wasp manages to make the cockroach go where they want, with seemingly very little guidance, or why the cockroaches always run instead of walking. In fact, there's quite a lot we still don't know about the Dementor wasp because they were only discovered in 2014. But regardless of the cause, these poor little roaches march themselves straight to their own death. But that death is not quick. Once the wasp has the roach in their lair, they essentially inject the cockroach with their eggs. The cockroach is still alive, but because of the mind-altering venom, they can't leave. They can't move without the guidance of the wasp, and she certainly doesn't want her victim going anywhere. Not now it's full of her unborn babies. And so the cockroach remains in the burrow, alive and unmoving, as the wasp's eggs incubate beneath their exoskeleton. And then, after a few days, the eggs hatch into larvae, and then things get even worse. Like I said, the cockroach is still alive at this point, but the larvae need to feed. And beneath the hard exoskeleton of their host is all of this soft flesh just waiting to be consumed. But the larvae are careful in how they eat the cockroach. After all, they want their food to stay fresh for as long as possible. So they very deliberately begin their feast on the least vital parts of the cockroach, keeping it alive for as long as possible, even while it's being eaten. Eventually, when they have nothing left, they'll move on to things like the essential organs, and the cockroach will finally die. Without a doubt, it's a slow and agonising death. I can only hope that the wasp's toxin also blocks their pain receptors, because otherwise, it really doesn't bear thinking about. Eventually, once there's nothing left of their host, the wasp larvae will metamorphise into adult Dementor wasps, and after mating, the females will go through the whole horrific cycle all over again, hunting down a cockroach to become the incubator and buffet of their children. So yeah, genuinely horrifying, and I couldn't think of a more perfect fit for a Halloween special. Even the appearance of the Dementor wasp seems perfect for this time of year, with their markings being black and red or orange. But there's more to these guys than their feeding habits. Dementor wasps originate from the Greater Mekong region, which spans across 200 million acres, encompassing areas of 6 different countries: China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Known as the Rice Bowl of Asia due to its economic importance, the Greater Mekong sub-region is named after the Mekong River, whose path it follows. And it's an essential hub for wildlife. According to the World Wildlife Fund, the Mekong River is second only to the Amazon River in terms of fish biodiversity. And even out of the water, it's home to a wide range of species, many of whom are endangered or found nowhere else on Earth. Some of whom have only recently been described by science, like the Dementor wasp. Within the last 2 decades, over 2,000 new species have been found there that were previously unknown to science. The Dementors hail specifically from the Thai area of the Greater Mekong. It was only 10 years ago that they were first described. One of 140 new species from the Mekong to be formally identified by the Natural History Museum in Berlin, Germany. If you're wondering, when a species is described as being, well, described, that basically means that they've been proven and accepted to exist by science. People often used to use the word discovered to refer to this process, and even now some people still do, but it has somewhat fallen out of favour due to its colonial undertones. Often when someone would be credited with discovering a species, it actually just meant that they were the first to describe them in formal scientific literature, even if the species had been known about by indigenous people for centuries beforehand. Their knowledge about the natural world was frequently discounted unless it had been backed up by a wealthy white man. I mean, I'm sure some of you already knew that, but there were probably also people who didn't. And you guys know by now how passionate I am about education. But I digress. Back to Dementor wasps. You might be wondering about their name. Like, isn't that a Harry Potter reference? And yes, unfortunately it is. Yeah, you thought wasps turning cockroaches into zombies was going to be the scariest thing in this Halloween special, when in reality, the truly terrifying thing here is that these wasps are now forever tied to a woman who has made misogyny and hatred her entire personality. It's actually not all that uncommon for a newly discovered species to be named after a celebrity, although the homage is usually in their scientific name. And most of the public figures who get species named after them aren't awful people. For example, in 1995, when a new species of extinct prehistoric sea turtle was identified from a fossil, it was given the scientific name Psephophorus terry pratchetti, after the author Terry Pratchett. It was an homage made because his Discworld series was set in, well, Discworld, a world which is carried on the back of a giant turtle floating through space. There are actually a lot of species that have been named after famous people. There have been spiders named after the likes of David Bowie and ABBA, sea sponges named in honour of Stan Lee and Jimi Hendrix, and beetles named after Nelson Mandela and, most delightfully, the Beatles. Literally, its scientific name is Tomophagus the Beatles. Honestly, I kind of want to do a whole episode now on just species that have been named after famous people. I've never given it much thought before, but it turns out there are probably hundreds out there. Should I do that? I might add it to my list. I feel like that could be fun. I have, once again, managed to fall down a rabbit hole that has nothing to do with the topic of this episode. Please excuse me as I desperately try to segue my way back. Usually when a species is named after someone famous, it's done by the person who first formally described that species as a tribute. So you might be assuming that Michael Ohl, the guy who first described Ampelexis dementor, was just a big fan of Harry Potter. And I mean, he might be, I don't know. But that's not relevant because he wasn't the one who named them. As a way of trying to get the public more interested in obscure species, and to spread awareness on the importance of biodiversity, Berlin's Natural History Museum decided to hold a competition to allow the public to choose the name. The name Dementor was chosen because the wasp's behaviour of basically turning cockroaches into hollow shells of themselves reminded people of the way the Dementors in Harry Potter suck out people's souls and leave them in a similar state. Apparently. I never actually read or watched Harry Potter as a kid, so I don't actually know. I was too busy with Erin Hunter's Warrior Cats series to read anything else, which honestly explains a lot. And if the goal of this competition was to get the public more aware of this species, then it worked. I mean, I'm not sitting here making an entire mini-episode about any of the other species they described. But there was more to it than just going, wow, look at that weird creature, want to name it? Biodiversity loss isn't as often discussed as other parts of climate change, and much of that is because most of the species that we're losing aren't the big charismatic ones. People want to save elephants and polar bears and tigers, but just as important are the smaller species, the ones most of us will never even know about before they disappear forever. They still play a vital role in the world's ecosystems that can't be replaced, but they don't get the attention of the cooler animals. Which means that they also don't get the funding or the research or any of the things that they need to get if we're going to save them. And so anything that educates people as to the importance of biodiversity and random invertebrate species you've never otherwise heard of is a key part of the fight to save our planet. There hasn't been much research done into dementor wasps. We don't know how much of an impact they have on the environment. It could well be that they're an essential part of keeping cockroach numbers at a sustainable level for the rest of the ecosystem. Ecosystems are fragile. If you lose even a single species of insect, it can have wide-reaching consequences, including ones for both the big charismatic animals we actually care about and for ourselves. In the natural world, everything is interconnected. You can't try and protect one species without protecting all of them. Even though we haven't known about their existence for long, the dementor wasp is already considered to be threatened due to the destruction of their habitat. Like I said earlier, the Greater Mekong area is one of the world's greatest biodiversity hotspots, but it's also one of the most vulnerable places to the impacts of climate change. Rising temperatures, the degradation of ecosystems, the illegal wildlife trade, deforestation, and biodiversity loss are all threats to this region, and it's not just wildlife that are at risk. The Greater Mekong region is home to over 300 million people, and around 80% of those people are dependent on rivers, forests, and wetlands for their lives and livelihood. When it comes to the climate crisis's impact on humans, there are few places on Earth where people are more vulnerable than here. And yet, as is always the case when it comes to those most affected by climate change, they weren't the ones who caused this. You don't need me to preach to you about the importance of protecting the planet, I know. But so often in the climate movement, people seem to focus primarily on animals and plants, and of course those things are important, but we often seem to forget about the impact it's already having on people around the world. Like the fact that there are already climate refugees, people who've been forced to flee their homes because of climate change, or the fact that climate change directly leads to an increase in child marriage. I don't know how to wrap up this episode. It started so light-hearted and spoopy. I didn't really expect it to end with talking about the horrors of the climate crisis. I'm so sorry. Although, I mean, it is Halloween, and what's scarier than climate change? Thank you so much for listening to this bonus minisode of the Animal Nerd podcast. New episodes come out every single Tuesday, plus bonus minisodes like this at least once a month. Any and all money made from this podcast goes to Animal Sanctuary, the Little Rescue Zoo. So if you would like to support the show, then that would mean the world to me, and to their rescue animals too. I'll be back next Tuesday with a significantly less spooky new episode. So until then, stay wild, friends, and happy Halloween!